and they can kind of understand where it's come from, so the source, and what its potential is across multiple applications. And I think with chefs and cooks in particular, they work with ingredients and create incredible textures that are quite varied, which means you get an entirely different experience and textural kind of quality to it. So it's very similar to how you process and work with materials. So you can kind of think about something like algae, which a lot of people are working with currently, especially within fashion. I think there's a lot of work being done with color and algae and eliminating kind of chemicals within dyeing processes, especially, or whether it's in an architectural setting, and that can be used as fuel to power an entire building, or it can be used as insulation. It is obviously food in lots of Eastern cultures. It's so many things. It can be turned into a solid surface as well, because seaweed, which is a macroalgae, has a gelatinous kind of sticky texture to it, and that's its own self-binding agent, which is a glue of sorts. There's so many things that it can actually translate into, and I think that's a very similar kind of process to cooking, and it's just scaled to different degrees. And I think the impact something like that can make is incredibly positive in terms of like its regenerative nature, as in how it grows. It grows in water rather than it growing on land, for example, and it grows in lots of different types of water, and there's thousands and thousands of species of algae, micro and macro, but also algae and seaweeds, they basically produce up to 80% of the world's oxygen. So we have to really look after that and not think of it as a universal solution to all of our problems, which is something that we need to be more mindful of. So I think positive impact isn't necessarily addressing something that is a solution for all. It's really being very considerate as to how much we have of it, how often it can grow, the climate conditions that it needs to thrive. Because for me, a lot of this is about thriving and not just surviving. So for me, that's where we need to be heading. And I think materials such as algae have that potential, and it's just being more respectful of it, basically.
Yeah, I think algae is a really good example to kick us off with, because Celine, I know you recently did a project called One by One with the United Nations, which was a design incubation project between designers and scientists. And Philip Lim actually used algae as sequins, didn't he? Maybe you can tell us more about that.
Yes, absolutely. So the One by One is the first science incubator in the fashion industry. It was done with the help and the support of Swarovski for the first year, as well as the United Nations Office for Partnerships. And it was, operated and created by the Slow Factory Foundation. The One by One paired a designer with a scientist, and we had, for the first pilot year, 3 pairs. One of them was Philip Lim and scientist designer Charlotte McCurdy, who has been working and experimenting with algae and has been exploring ways to create plastic alternatives, although that's not really her main focus, but the same type of materials that could have the same properties as plastic. And when Philip and Charlotte got together, Philip saw the material and said, "Can you make sequins?" And she said, "Oh, probably." So let's try. And so the whole incubator was to really champion new ideas and create a space for innovation at the intersection of fashion and science, and basically design and science coming together for the first time in the fashion industry under these circumstances where there isn't any economic pressure. There's just, the desire to innovate, to get out of the lab what could be brought to the market, and to really bring in science also, design outside of the fashion industry, closer to the science industry, so that there could be a meaningful collaboration that could happen there.
I think there were some other really lovely examples in that project. So obviously there were the carbon sequestering algae sequence, which is a brilliant environmental impact. But maybe you can tell us about Mara Hoffman's project, which was a kind of social impact.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So Mara Hoffman was paired with Custom Collaborative. Custom Collaborative is a workforce development, training, and preparing Black and Brown women in Harlem to have significant positions in the fashion industry. So it's a workforce development and education not-for-profit, working with women in horrible conditions. To be honest, they are at the brink of poverty, and they are supporting them and helping them really find skill training and working in the fashion industry in a significant way. So with Mara Hoffman, Mara and Custom Collaborative were already working together in the past, because Mara's goal has always been to create a sort of a regenerative economy locally. And so they were already in conversation with Custom Collaborative. What One by One offered them was to accelerate their ideas. We funded them and we allowed them to focus for 1 year on how to create a framework that could be copied by the fashion industry, and an effective framework on how do we work with marginalized communities. What kind of process do we need to create, and what are the trainings and skill building and confidence building opportunities that we can create together to accelerate this transition.
I want to come back to something that Sital said earlier, which I guess kind of links to, you made the comparison with food and chefs, and maybe there's another comparison to be made in that people say with food, everything is fine in moderation. And so I think an important part of this that we need to discuss is how can designers and brands determine the appropriate scale for their sustainable innovations so that they can preserve that positive impact and not tip the balance into excess? Sital, do you want to start?
Sure. I think for me, a lot of it comes down to looking outside of the fashion industry or the design industry. We need to look beyond what is surrounding us in the kind of immediate sort of periphery. I think we are so used to kind of living in those bubbles or those worlds that we create, and I think that's great, but we also need to be aware of like how materials are surviving outside of those industries. And I think it's about connecting to other voices, and other voices being a really integral part to kind of understanding, the history of it, where it's actually located, what does it need to kind of be fed and watered, and the climate conditions that it needs to survive in. How much of it do we have available to us? Where does it grow, and what conditions does it? I've kind of said that already, but there's so many other people that need to be part of that conversation before we understand like the impact that it can create, because a lot of that can actually be quite negative if misunderstood. And I think there's such a care and respect involved in how we treat materials, and it's really about building those kinships between the material world and the human world, and where we've been so sort of distanced from that for some time. And I think so much part of my practice is very much about humanizing materials. So they're building relationships to the non-human world. So therefore, we're starting to realize how similar we actually are to one another, and that we aren't the dominant species to kind of be, we need to listen to materials, actually. I think the more we listen to materials, the more we kind of observe them, we start to learn how to treat them, basically. We've been so used to forcing them to be something that perhaps they haven't really, it's basically having multiple voices as part of this conversation. So anthropologists, scientists, geologists even, so many people can, and even citizens actually. I think it's really, really important that just an everyday citizen is a part of this conversation, as well as like the more informed perhaps, because I think for me, like the way materials have been kind of living, it's like academia and sciences, and you know, the people that have been able to have access to this kind of knowledge have been trained formally in these sectors, and therefore it hasn't been able to be shared in a way that feels relatable and accessible. And I think for me, I'm bridging those worlds, so it's not something that is just put in this very sort of highly kind of trained eye, basically. I think materials affect everybody and everything. Everything is made from something. It's something that I definitely discuss quite a lot in my practice. And I think if we want to make an impact, then, and a positive one, it needs to be for all and not just for the few. So I'm really, really kind of keen on like changing the language around materials, and I think that's a first step towards something that actually can create some kind of connection or relationship or relationality first. We need to build that before we can understand like how to work with the materials themselves, because they've been in a space where we've really disrespected them and have misunderstood them. So yeah, very much like a middle child, I would say, a misunderstood person. The materials are conduits between everything and everyone, I would say, and that's kind of how I describe them, and even myself. So yeah, that's kind of why I call myself a translator. So I have to speak many different languages, whether it be written or vocal or some embodied languages or intelligences, and it's not just polemical. So sound, scent, smell, taste even, I think so much of that needs to be expressed a lot more. And for me, that's actually decolonizing language, which means it becomes something that is shared and expressed beyond just a linear or singular way of knowing, basically. And that comes back to this idea of multiples. So yes, I think it's all about pluralities, ultimately.
And I think that comes back to what you were saying earlier, Celine, about working with marginalized communities. There's an interesting example, a designer called Fernando Lapos, who works with his kind of local indigenous community in Mexico. And can you hear me and see me? I feel like we should pause.
No, we can hear you and see you.
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, I just can't see either of you.
Oh, no.
Is it your connection, maybe?
Sital, I just am such a big fan of your work, and I cannot agree more with what you were saying earlier. It's so true that it's about decolonizing language, and language not just through the words that we understand, but language has many forms, and it's really great.
Yay, I'm so glad. It's a really hard fight to fight, I think, with a lot of things. And yeah.
And in the one by one, it was also about translating, because when we brought scientists and designers together, you would think, okay, they're going to figure it out. But no, there was so much translation that needed to happen between the two disciplines.
Completely, and they speak very different languages.
Absolutely,
also. And
they do.
How do you kind of bring them together? And like, so there's like a synergy, I think, that can happen and emerge, and perhaps something that an alternative future kind of emerges from all of that as well, once those voices are together.
And a new language as well, because it's not something that existed before, since everything was siloed. You know, the industries were not meant to connect in that way. So there isn't any shared language that the two of them could rely on. It was a lot of we were misunderstanding everything, as you said earlier. That's why maybe designers misunderstand materials, and science misunderstands the use of these materials in design. There was the need to translate and to create a common vocabulary, a shared common language between the two disciplines. And I feel like that was the main body of work that we were able to develop as a foundation, was to create the beginning of this language for them, not for the whole world, but just for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that hybridity somehow becomes something new, basically. And then it becomes a language that they have shared between one another, and they understand one another because of it. And how that can then feel like... Sorry, go on, Bana.
Yeah, Celine, I think you pick up on something that I wanted to talk about, actually, which is that designing for positive impact and collaborating between industries is not necessarily something that fashion designers have been taught through fashion education. And so there's a certain amount of retraining and recalibration that needs to happen. From the initiatives that you've run through Slow Factory Foundation, why is collaboration so important, and what kind of challenges may arise through that process? How can we better prepare designers to be good collaborators?
That's such a good question. Definitely. So, we have been working with the United Nations in supporting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are a way, if you will, if they are a policy document that would hopefully be used by all industries to reach the goals that the UN has defined to address global climate change. And one of these goals, it's goal 17, it's partnerships. And it's my favorite goal because it's through these partnerships that we are able to accelerate the innovations that we are seeking to achieve. And again, as I said earlier, these collaborations, across sectors, across industries, have not really been something common in the past. What's common is each industry runs in its silos, and the collaborations we've seen in the fashion industry were at the level of marketing. They were in a creative space, if you will, where a few logos are swapped together and there's some kind of visual design or aesthetic that's put together, and that's pretty much where the collaboration ends. And where we went was a little deeper in collaborating on the building and the growing even of certain materials, in particularly with the leather that we worked with with Public School and Dr. Thean Shiros, where she works with a nanocellulose leather. It's basically microbial leather, a leather that grows like kombucha. It's also very similar to how kombucha grows. And so they were growing and shaping this leather together. And there needed to be a shared language between design and science. There needed to be a shared understanding of these two disciplines. And that's how we are able, through education, to facilitate collaboration. Another project we work on at Slow Factory is Open Education. It's a free, accessible sustainability literacy program, accessible to all and taught and led by Black, Brown, Indigenous, minority ethnic scholars, teachers, scientists. And the program, the Open EDU, has now over 10,000 students, which is incredible. We just launched this week. And what that does is creating this shared language and making it accessible, and teaching through the lens of a movement called peer-to-peer learning, which is basically non-institutionalized. It's from expert to expert, or scholar to scholar, scholar to public, and then eventually the public becomes a scholar, and so on. And so through education, we're able to create a language that facilitates, accelerates these types of collaborations that are on a deeper level than aesthetics.
Sisal, is there anything you would add to that based on your collaborations through Matter?
Well, yeah, I think what Celine and the Slow Factory are doing is very much aligned with the way that matter is as well, and how it kind of looks at language and literacy, or material illiteracy, I think, is somewhere we're existing currently. And I think education is the beginnings of that, for sure. I think the way that we are taught in design school is very much like product first kind of approach. And for me, it should be material first. And like material first approaches means that we're not really shoehorning in the material towards the end of our design process, which is something that we are being taught, really. And I think once people understand a material to some degree, that they can understand the behaviors of the material, the characteristics of the material, whether it's beyond the typological framework that it kind of currently exists in. So we understand materials such as wood, metal, plastic, textiles. So when we're visiting a materials library, they're framed in such a typological way, and that is something that not many people understand. You know, a wood actually can be flexible, it can be rigid, but it can also be cellulose for fabric. You know, there's so much that can actually come from a tree, resin even. So how can we just kind of, you know, pigeonhole this material to something that actually has so much potential? And those materials are not achieving that full potential. And textiles, for example, are made from so many things, and we just put it into one box. And that's really, really problematic, because the fibers that are composing these materials are made from so many sources and have come from many places. So if we aren't trained in these materials and we don't have the knowledge and the skills to kind of understand them, how are we supposed to implement them when we have 160,000 unique materials across the world, and yet we're still making more? We're not really using what we already have available to us. So for me, it's so much about that kind of miseducation, and almost like an unlearning that has to happen first, then a learning, and then a relearning. So it's, again, breaking down everything of what we've already been presented with and relearning it from a perspective of almost reconnecting to the non-human world first and then the human world again. So therefore we begin to be more planet-centric than human-centric. For me, that's kind of the way that we need to be taught within design school, or in any kind of school, I think, not just design. So yeah, that's kind of my approach really within education. It's something that I teach when I'm also tutoring. So yeah, it's material first, always.
And I suppose by putting materials first, you are inherently thinking about impact, because you will have an understanding of how that material works and what impacts it will have.
Yeah, because it's a web of connections. It's not just singular. You know, it's not like this take, make, waste model that is existing within this, I guess, capitalist society that we're all working in. But for me, there's many versions and many systems in which we can operate in. There's not just one that's for mass production. You know, that's one model, but there are so many other models that we can follow, whether it's designing for disassembly, whether it's designing for, versatility. For example, a single material can be so many things. You know, there's open source, for example, dematerialization, digital. There's so many ways in which we can operate in, and it's not just for mass production. And because not every material is meant for mass production, it just doesn't work. That's when negative impact actually happens, because we have misunderstood that world in itself.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Well, maybe to finish up, we could all just give our kind of key takeaways. So to the people watching this, what would you like them to take away from this so that they can really create the positive impact we've been discussing? Celine?
Yes, definitely. So I would encourage the fashion industry to divert from marketing into education. And I know that sounds bold and crazy, but through education, we can meet a lot of the same KPIs they're looking to meet, with a connection with the public and a way to influence the public in trusting them. And also, I would say, yes, I agree, material first, and human rights. And so I think the intersection of climate justice and human rights is very important. It shouldn't be competing with the material understanding or literacy, and material should not be competing with human rights. And as the fashion industry moves forward and dabbling into new materials, they need to understand that a whole system exists around these materials, and a set of human lives are impacted by these materials. And the choices to use non-toxic dyes, non-toxic processes are not only good for the earth, but they're good for the people. And as they invest in education, these choices, these educated solutions and educated decision-making becomes easier for them, less foreign. And the more they engage in learning and unlearning and relearning, the better they would make decisions, and the better leaders they would become.
Amazing. Sital, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would encourage all of that, and I completely agree with what Celine has just shared with us. And what I would add is speaking to people beyond the design industry and learning about their worlds and how they impact design, and vice versa. So, Celine, for example, has worked with the intersection of science and design, and that's becoming more and more common now. And I think it's really, really integral to kind of be able to share each other's worlds and how they can actually impact each other. And language is a really, really key component of that. So a series of translations and becoming more material literate, actually. And that's through language, and not just language of spoken and written, beyond that. So I think an embodied intelligence, or the immaterial world, is just as important as the material world. For me, they have to run in parallel. You can't have one without the other, and therefore value systems are questioned. So it's not just about the economical framework, it's also about immaterial value, and how that is such a really, really important part of the way that we design, actually, because so much of that is about instinct or intuitiveness, or even our lived experiences and our cultural context, the way that we've been brought up, our associations. All of these are really key components to building worlds that are positively impactful. So it's not just about doing something for the sake of it anymore. It's about having meaningful purpose and intentionality, actually. It's about multiples and pluralities and creating alternatives, basically.
I think that is a really lovely note to end on. Thank you both for sharing your expertise with us today. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope that everyone at home has as well. We hope you've enjoyed